Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment she stops gripping the connection is the moment he finally begins to move? What if it is not her effort, her pain, her chasing, or her constant emotional labor that awakens the masculine, but her relaxation? Why does he often begin to rise only after she softens her grip? Why does the energy shift when she stops carrying the bond through tension? Why does her calmness sometimes create more movement in him than all her previous trying ever did? Because when the divine feminine truly relaxes, she does not become passive. She becomes aligned. She stops managing the connection through fear. She stops holding everything together through overfunctioning. She stops making his pace the center of her nervous system. And in that relaxation, the old pattern begins to lose its power. Now he can no longer lean on her tension. Now he must meet the field more honestly. Now her peace becomes the space where his own rising can begin. In this video, we're going deep into why, when the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to rise, and why her grounded softness is often the very thing that restores movement, truth, and spiritual pressure in the connection. Chapter 1. Relaxation is not the same as giving up. One of the biggest misunderstandings in this journey is the idea that when the divine feminine relaxes, she is giving up. People see her become quieter, steadier, less reactive, less obsessed with signs, less emotionally available to chaos, and they assume something is ending. They assume she has gone cold. They assume she no longer cares. They assume she is disconnecting from the bond. But real relaxation is not disconnection. It is release. And that changes everything. Because before the divine feminine relaxes, she is often holding far more than she realizes. She is holding hope, fear, timing, outcome, meaning, silence, spiritual responsibility, emotional labor, and the constant inner pressure to keep the connection alive. Even when she is not outwardly chasing, inwardly she may still be gripping the story, gripping the possibility, gripping the pain, gripping the need for movement, gripping the invisible hope that if she just stays emotionally engaged enough, aware enough, devoted enough, everything will eventually shift. That gripping creates tension. And tension has energy. It keeps her nervous system turned toward him. It keeps her body organized around uncertainty. It keeps her heart tied to what is unresolved. It keeps the bond active through effort instead of truth. So when she finally relaxes, the change is much deeper than behavior. It is biological. It is emotional. It is spiritual. Relaxation means she stops trying to manage the connection through her nervous system. That is a holy shift. Because many divine feminines do not realize how much of their love has become entangled with effort. Effort to understand him. Effort to stay open. Effort to be patient. Effort to remain spiritually aligned while silently carrying pain. Effort to not collapse while still inwardly revolving around the connection every day. This kind of effort can look beautiful from the outside, but inside, it often feels like chronic tension. And chronic tension is not surrender. It is control mixed with longing. That is why relaxation matters so much. Because true relaxation is not the collapse of devotion. It is the purification of devotion. It is the moment she stops using tension as a substitute for trust. That is the first great truth of this chapter. When the divine feminine relaxes, she does not become lazy. She does not become numb. She does not become passive. She does not stop loving. She stops gripping. And gripping is not the same thing as loving. That distinction is everything. A woman can deeply love and still be tense. Deeply care and still be overfunctioning. Deeply feel the connection and still be trying internally to hold it together through vigilance, over-awareness, and emotional strain. Relaxation is what happens when she says, consciously or unconsciously. I will no longer carry this through force. I will no longer keep my body in a state of waiting. I will no longer measure my peace by his movement. I will no longer make uncertainty my home. That is not giving up. That is coming back to life. Because tension narrows a woman. It narrows her focus, narrows her emotional bandwidth, narrows her ability to feel her own body clearly, narrows her access to joy, pleasure, presence, and self-trust. When she has been gripping the connection too tightly, her energy begins living outside herself. Her inner world orients around him, around timing, around signs, around what is missing, around what is unresolved. Relaxation returns that energy home, back into her breath, back into her body, back into her mornings, back into her joy, back into her truth, back into the parts of life that do not revolve around waiting. That is why relaxation is not a withdrawal from the sacred. It is a return to it, because the sacred was never asking her to live in constant emotional contraction. The sacred was never asking her to become anxious in the name of love, never asking her to overmonitor a soul bond, never asking her to become the energetic manager of another person's awakening, never asking her to turn devotion into pressure. That is not sacred alignment. That is survival dressed as spirituality. And many women do not see it until they are exhausted enough to stop. Then one day something in her softens. Not in weakness, in wisdom. She notices how tired she is. How much effort it takes to keep caring in a tense way. How much of her life force has gone into waiting for movement rather than living her own life fully. How often she has called overfunctioning faith. How often she has called nervous system activation love. And in that noticing, the grip begins to loosen. That is relaxation. Not the loss of the bond. The loosening of fear around the bond. This is why real relaxation can feel so unfamiliar at first. A woman who has lived in tension may confuse relaxation with emptiness. She may think, if I stop gripping, I will lose the connection. If I stop holding it so tightly, everything will disappear. If I stop monitoring, hoping, waiting, feeling, translating, then maybe it was never real. But that fear is exactly what tension feeds on. Relaxation asks a different question. What if what is real does not need my tension to survive? That question changes everything. Because if something must be held together through chronic anxiety, overgiving, and emotional effort, then what is being sustained may not be truth. It may be a pattern, a loop, a structure built out of fear, longing, and over-responsibility. Relaxation interrupts that structure. It does not destroy love. It removes distortion around love. That is why the divine feminine relaxing is so spiritually significant. She is no longer trying to hold open what only truth can hold. She is no longer making her body the bridge for two people. She is no longer carrying the energetic burden of when, how, why, and what does this mean? Now she breathes. Now she rests. Now she allows. And allowing is not apathy. It is trust without force. That kind of trust changes the entire field. Because before relaxation, the connection may still have been saturated with her tension. Tension keeps things loud. It keeps the field moving. It keeps the emotional current active. It keeps her internally bracing around what he is doing or not doing. That bracing becomes part of the bond's atmosphere. Then she relaxes. Now the atmosphere changes. Less urgency. Less fear. Less invisible management. Less one-sided energetic labor. And once the atmosphere changes, the old pattern begins losing its support system. This is why relaxation is powerful. Not because she does something dramatic. Because she stops doing something constant. She stops tightening around the bond. Stops holding it in her body. Stops feeding it through unrest. stops making tension the proof that she still cares. That is when real peace begins entering. And peace is not passive. Peace is honest. Peace says, I care, but I will not collapse. I feel this, but I will not carry it through strain. I honor the bond, but I return responsibility to where it belongs. I remain open to truth, but I do not use tension as devotion anymore. That is the divine feminine in her deeper power. Not frantic. Not frozen. Not forcing. Relaxed. And relaxed does not mean weak. It means regulated. It means she is no longer bleeding energy into what is unresolved. No longer living in reaction. No longer making his pace the ruler of her inner state. This is why the title matters so much. When the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to rise. Because her relaxation changes the very structure he was unconsciously relating to. If she has been carrying the field through tension, then the moment she stops, something becomes very different. More honest, less managed, more revealing. And in that revealed field, his own soul has fewer places to hide. But before we even get to him, we have to fully understand her. Her relaxation is sacred because it is the end of self-abandonment through strain. It is the end of trying to love something into truth by staying tense around it. It is the end of trying to awaken him by staying overawake for both of them. It is the end of the belief that love must feel like pressure to be real. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 1. Relaxation is not the same as giving up. It is the divine feminine releasing control, tension, overfunctioning, and nervous system gripping around the connection. It is her return to self, to embodiment, to peace, to trust without force. She is not loving less. She is loving without distortion. She is no longer making his movement the center of her emotional world. And in that relaxation, the old pattern begins losing the very tension that was keeping it alive. Because sometimes the connection does not begin shifting when she tries harder. Sometimes it shifts when she finally exhales. Chapter 2. Her tension was holding the old pattern together. One of the hardest truths in this journey is this. Sometimes it is not only his avoidance that keeps the pattern stuck. Sometimes her tension is helping hold it together. That can be difficult to hear, especially when the divine feminine's heart has been genuine, loving, patient, and deeply committed to the bond. But sincerity does not automatically mean alignment. Love can be real, and the way it is being carried can still keep both people trapped in repetition. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. Her tension was holding the old pattern together. Not because she intended to control anything. Not because she was malicious. Not because her love was false. But because tension has a function. It sustains. It grips. It monitors. It keeps energy moving. It creates an invisible pressure around the connection that can keep the old dynamic alive long after truth is asking for something different. Before the divine feminine relaxes, she may still be emotionally holding the bond through anxiety, over-awareness, spiritual over-responsibility, and subtle internal pursuit. Even if she is not texting him, not talking to him, not outwardly chasing in obvious ways, inwardly she may still be tightly involved. She may still be watching for signs, checking the energy, replaying conversations, trying to understand his wounds, making sense of his silence, staying psychically available, holding hope like a burden, and unconsciously using her nervous system to keep the bond active. That is tension, and tension has power. This is what many people do not understand about the spiritual dynamic between the divine feminine and divine masculine. They think the only thing that sustains the runner-chaser pattern is obvious behavior. But often the pattern is being held together by much more subtle forces. Inner gripping, emotional labor, energetic monitoring, the refusal to let reality fully become reality. As long as she is still doing that, the old pattern has fuel. That fuel matters because it keeps the field alive in a certain form. It keeps him emotionally central. It keeps the atmosphere warm enough that his delay does not have to fully meet consequence. It keeps the bond in motion through her nervous system even when his own movement is weak, delayed, or absent. This is why the connection can stay stuck for so long. Not because nothing is real, but because one soul is still carrying too much of the energy. The divine feminine may believe her tension is helping the bond survive, helping the spiritual thread stay open, helping him feel her, helping maintain connection while he figures himself out. But in many cases, tension does not help truth. It helps repetition. That is the painful paradox. Because tension can feel like devotion. It can feel like, I care deeply. I am staying open. I am honoring the connection. I am doing the emotional work. I am spiritually holding space. But if that holding space is filled with anxiety, overfunctioning, inner gripping, and unconscious control, then what she is actually holding may not be sacred movement. It may be the old loop. That is why this chapter is so important. Because as long as she remains tense around the bond, the old dynamic can continue breathing. He stays partially buffered. She stays partially overextended. The field remains emotionally alive enough that both souls can stay in relation to the pattern instead of standing fully in truth. He avoids. She holds. He delays. She monitors. He stays unclear. She keeps trying to feel, understand, interpret, and energetically maintain what is unresolved. This becomes its own structure. A structure built not only on his silence, but on her tension. And tension is incredibly sticky. It does not let things die easily. It does not let truth become still. It does not let absence become absence. It does not let the bond stand on its own without her constant, invisible management. This is why the divine feminine's tension can unintentionally protect the very pattern she wants to outgrow. It may protect him from facing himself. Protect her from facing what is not mutual in the present. Protect the bond from falling into uncomfortable clarity. And clarity is often exactly what awakening needs. Imagine a woman who is still tightly holding the bond in her body. She wakes up thinking about him, falls asleep wondering what he feels, measures her emotional state by subtle signs, feels the need to keep spiritually tuned in, feels responsible for maintaining the connection at an energetic level, feels that if she fully stops, something sacred will be lost. That is not relaxation. That is a highly activated form of holding. And that activated holding creates pressure in the field. Pressure he may feel unconsciously. Pressure that keeps him somewhat engaged without requiring full embodiment. Pressure that makes the connection feel alive, but not necessarily free. This matters because pressure can make the masculine stay partly reactive instead of becoming truly responsible. He may feel her tension, feel her emotional grip, feel that some part of her is still carrying the momentum. As long as that remains true, he does not have to generate all of his own movement. Some of the bond's motion is still being produced by her. This is why true rising often begins only after she relaxes. Because then the field is no longer being held together by tension. Then he is no longer relating mainly to her gripping energy. Then the pattern begins losing one of its deepest support systems. That support system was not her love. It was the anxious way love was being carried. There is a huge difference. Love can remain. The tension must go. And until the tension goes, the old structure often remains much stronger than people realize. This is why relaxing is not weak. It is revolutionary. Because when the divine feminine relaxes, she is no longer sustaining the bond through vigilance. She is no longer acting as the emotional regulator of the entire connection. She is no longer making his delay easier to live inside by staying psychically engaged with it every moment. She is no longer turning unresolved love into a full-time inner job. And when that job ends, the old pattern begins to lose shape. This can feel terrifying at first, because tension often creates the illusion of control. It gives her something to do, something to feel, something to manage, something to hold. Without it, she may feel empty for a while. Still, even disoriented. But that stillness is sacred, because stillness reveals what tension was covering. And what tension was covering may have been the imbalance, the exhaustion, the one-sided labor, the truth that the bond cannot grow through her strain alone. That is the revelation of Chapter 2. Her tension was holding the old pattern together because tension kept her inwardly attached to the role of emotional carrier. It kept the field active, kept him partly buffered, and kept the bond from falling into cleaner truth. The more she held through anxiety, the less space there was for reality to speak without distortion. Her tension felt like devotion, but often it was also fear of letting go, fear of stillness, fear of what would be revealed if she stopped managing the bond from the inside. And until that tension relaxes, the old pattern can keep repeating, even while both souls feel exhausted by it. This is why relaxation becomes sacred. Not because it destroys the bond, because it stops protecting the pattern. And once the pattern is no longer protected, truth finally has room to rise. Chapter 3. When she relaxes, the field changes. There is a kind of change that does not begin with words. It begins with energy, with atmosphere, with nervous systems, with what is no longer being carried, with what is no longer being fed, with the subtle but unmistakable shift that happens when the divine feminine finally relaxes. And when she truly relaxes, the field changes. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. Not just her mood, not just her behavior, the field, the emotional environment of the bond, the energetic structure both souls have been living inside, the invisible climate that was shaped for so long by her tension, her over-awareness, her longing, her inward gripping, and her constant subtle effort to hold the connection together. That climate matters more than most people realize. Because people often focus on the visible story. Who texted? Who reached out? Who withdrew? Who said what? Who moved and who did not move? But beneath all of that, there is a deeper layer. The field. And the field is often what determines how the connection feels long before either person can explain it in words. Before the divine feminine relaxes, the field may still be saturated with urgency. Even if she is trying to stay composed on the outside, inwardly she may still be carrying pressure. Pressure to keep the bond alive. Pressure to stay spiritually tuned in. Pressure to understand him, help him, hold him, wait correctly, trust correctly, surrender correctly. Pressure to not lose the thread. That pressure has energy. It creates a subtle emotional gravity around him. It keeps her partially oriented toward his movement. It keeps the field emotionally busy. It keeps the bond from becoming still enough to tell the truth. That is what tension does. It fills space. Even when nothing is outwardly happening, tension is happening. And tension makes the field dense. Dense with fear. Dense with hope. Dense with management. Dense with the quiet but relentless message. I am still carrying this. Then she relaxes. Not as performance. Not by pretending she no longer cares. But genuinely. She exhales. She releases her inner grip. She stops organizing her body around uncertainty. She stops using her nervous system as the place where the unresolved connection is constantly processed. She returns to herself. And in that return, something fundamental changes. The field becomes quieter, cleaner, less emotionally crowded, less saturated with her effort. This is what so many people feel, but do not know how to name. They say, the energy shifted. Yes, because it did. And the shift is not small. Because now the connection is no longer being continuously animated by her tension. That means something very important. The old emotional atmosphere begins dissolving. Before, he may have been living inside a field that still contained her hope, her longing, her overattunement, her invisible labor. That field kept him emotionally central. It may have softened the cost of his delay. It may have made the connection feel constantly active, even while nothing fully grounded was happening. He may not have consciously known how much of that activity came from her, but his system was still inside it. Now that atmosphere changes. Now the field is no longer warm in the same anxious way. It is more still. And stillness changes everything. Because stillness reveals. When the field is crowded by her tension, there is always something moving, something to react to, something to sustain the loop. But when she relaxes, the loop loses fuel. The atmosphere becomes less managed, less one-sidedly carried, less emotionally inflated by fear. And that means truth gets louder. This is why the masculine often begins feeling more after the feminine relaxes. Not because she is sending more, because she is finally sending less distortion. The field is no longer constantly shaped by her nervous system activation, no longer organized around her need for movement, no longer held together by the pressure of her overfunctioning. That absence of distortion can be deeply confronting, because now the connection must stand differently. Not on tension, on truth. Imagine a room that has always been full of low-level noise. You get used to it. You stop noticing it. It becomes the background. Then one day the noise stops. Suddenly, you hear the room differently. You hear yourself differently. You notice the stillness. You notice things that were always there but covered by sound. That is what happens when she relaxes. The noise of tension stops. And now both souls can hear the field differently. This is why relaxation is not passive. It is revelatory. Because now there is space. Space where there was once gripping. Space where there was once emotional labor. Space where there was once subtle inward pursuit. And space is powerful. Space makes the old pattern visible. Space reveals what had been overheld. Space removes the familiar emotional pressure that once gave the bond its old shape. The masculine may not know how to describe this. He may only feel. Something feels quieter now. Something feels different. Something that once pressed on him in a familiar way is no longer there. And because it is no longer there, something inside him is starting to move. That is the field changing. The field had once been organized around her tension. Now it is being reorganized around her peace. And peace is not a neutral force. It has structure. It has gravity. It has presence. It has truth. Her peace says, I am no longer carrying this through strain. I am no longer making your pace the center of my body. I am no longer feeding the old dynamic with my vigilance. I am here, but I am here with myself now. That changes the masculine's experience of the bond completely. Because now he is not only feeling her emotional activity, he is feeling her self-possession. And self-possession creates a very different field than anxious devotion. Anxious devotion keeps things emotionally available. Self-possession makes things emotionally clear. Clarity can feel much more confronting than availability. Because clarity leaves fewer places to hide. This is why when she relaxes, the field may become less dramatic, but more spiritually charged. Less noise, more truth. Less emotional motion, more real pressure. Less old loop intensity, more inner reckoning. The old pattern often depended on movement. Signs. Emotional spikes. Pain. Hope. the continual circulation of unresolved energy. But when she relaxes, that circulation slows down. Now the field no longer keeps repeating the same message. Now the message becomes, what is actually here without her tension feeding it? That question can shake him deeply. Because maybe what is here is his own silence, his own emotional inertia, his own fear, his own unresolved longing, his own dependence on the field she used to maintain. And once the field is quiet enough, all of that becomes easier to feel. This is why many masculines begin to rise only after the feminine relaxes. Because her relaxation changes the energetic conditions. It stops over-carrying him, stops over-signaling, stops over-holding the loop together. And with those things gone, he is no longer mainly responding to her tension. He is being left with his own truth inside a different field. That field is cleaner, less padded, less emotionally managed, less willing to let him stay half present without feeling it. This can feel like more pressure, not less. But it is a different kind of pressure. Not pressure from her. Pressure from truth. Before, the field was crowded enough that he could remain partly buffered. Now it is quiet enough that he begins hearing what his soul has been saying underneath the noise. This is why the title is so important. When the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to rise. Because her relaxation changes the field from one of management to one of revelation. And revelation makes rising more possible. Not because she made him rise, but because she stopped holding the old atmosphere in place. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 3. When the divine feminine relaxes, the field changes. Her inner state shifts the emotional and energetic atmosphere of the bond. She becomes calmer, less reactive, less controlling, and less overextended. The connection is no longer being carried through tension, urgency, and subtle inward pursuit. As a result, the field becomes quieter, cleaner, and more honest. That honesty makes the old pattern more visible and gives the masculine fewer places to hide from his own truth. He may not immediately understand what changed, but he feels it. Because once the field is no longer shaped by her tension, something in him begins meeting the connection differently. And that is often where his rising begins. Because sometimes the biggest change in a connection is not what someone does. It is what stops being carried in the unseen. Chapter 4. He feels the absence of her tension. One of the deepest reasons he begins to shift when the divine feminine relaxes is this. He feels the absence of her tension. Not just her silence. Not just her reduced effort. Not just the fact that she is no longer chasing, monitoring, over-explaining, or emotionally gripping the bond in the same way. He feels the absence of the tension itself. And that can affect him far more deeply than most people realize. Because before she relaxed, her tension had become part of the field. Part of the atmosphere. Part of the emotional structure. Part of the energetic climate both souls were unconsciously living inside. That tension may have looked like hope, like patience, like emotional devotion, like holding space, like being spiritually aware and deeply invested. But underneath, much of it was still tension. The tension of waiting, the tension of watching, the tension of trying to stay open while inwardly bracing, the tension of carrying uncertainty in the body every day, the tension of feeling responsible for the connection's emotional continuity. That tension was not neutral. It was doing something. It was generating movement, generating pressure, generating a familiar emotional signal around him. And as long as that signal remained, he was still relating to the bond through it. That is why Chapter 4 matters so much. Because many people think that when the divine feminine relaxes, the masculine only notices what she stopped doing. But often, what he notices first is what is no longer pressing on the field. The tension is gone. The invisible urgency. The subtle energetic gripping. the emotional holding that once made the bond feel constantly active. That absence can be startling, because tension, while exhausting, also creates continuity. It keeps the field busy, keeps the bond emotionally loud, keeps him psychically central, keeps the atmosphere organized around unresolved movement. When that tension disappears, the old field does not feel the same at all. And he may not understand why. He may only know. Something feels quieter now. Something feels farther away in a different way. Something familiar is missing. And because that familiar thing is missing, the whole connection feels more honest than before. That familiar thing is often her tension. Imagine being in a room with a constant hum in the background. At first you do not notice it, because it is always there. It becomes part of the environment. Then one day it stops. Suddenly, the room feels different. Not because something new entered, but because something old is no longer shaping the space. That is what happens here. Her tension had become part of the background hum of the bond. And when she relaxes, the hum stops. Now the masculine is no longer feeling the connection through her constant internal gripping. He is no longer receiving the old signal that she is still carrying the pressure, still managing the atmosphere, still holding the emotional tension in her body for both of them. That can feel deeply unsettling, because tension, while painful, can also become strangely familiar. It gives shape to the dynamic. It lets him stay partly buffered by the fact that some part of her is still doing so much emotionally. As long as she is tense, the field still has a kind of emotional momentum. Her unrest keeps something moving, keeps something warm, keeps something open. When she relaxes, that momentum slows. And this is where he begins to feel the absence of her tension. Why does that matter so much? Because the absence of tension creates space. And space is not empty. Space reveals. Before, her tension may have been filling the field with enough activity that he did not have to fully feel what was underneath. He could still orient to her energy, still sense the pressure, still unconsciously receive the message that the bond was being held in place through her nervous system. That made it easier for him to remain in partial passivity. Now that pressure is gone. Now there is less emotional scaffolding holding the atmosphere together. Now the same bond feels different. Less managed. Less padded. Less emotionally inflated. More still. That stillness can be very confronting. Because when a field is no longer held together by tension, whatever remains becomes much easier to hear. His own silence, his own delay, his own lack of movement, his own unresolved feelings, his own fear, his own dependence on the field she used to maintain. This is why he may begin thinking of her more after she relaxes. Not because she is doing more. Because there is less tension standing between him and truth. That is the paradox. Her tension once made the connection feel active, but it also kept it clouded. Her relaxation makes the connection quieter, but often clearer. And clarity can hit much harder than activity. He may begin noticing that her energy feels different now. Less emotionally reaching. Less anxious. Less overinvested in whether he moves or not. Less available to the old loop. This can feel like absence. But it is a very specific kind of absence. Not the absence of love. The absence of pressure. The absence of the old emotional strain that once kept the bond emotionally loud. And once that strain is gone, he can no longer lean on it unconsciously. He may begin to feel the connection in a more direct way. Not through her tension. Through the space her tension used to occupy. That can create a kind of inner unease. Because before, her tension was still doing part of the work. It was keeping the emotional current moving. It was making his own inertia less obvious. It was allowing him to live inside a field that still had momentum even while he remained partly still. Now he has to feel what happens when no one is tightly holding the connection in place anymore. What happens? The stillness begins speaking. And what the stillness says may not be comfortable. It may say, "You are not moving. You are no longer being carried by her urgency. You are no longer being buffered by her emotional labor. The old atmosphere is gone. Now what is actually here in you?" That is a difficult question, because it removes a lot of the old ambiguity. When her tension was present, he could still remain in relationship to her tension. He could still feel the field through her vigilance. But now that she has relaxed, he must feel the field more through himself. That is much more exposing. This is why the absence of her tension can create spiritual pressure in him. Not because she is pressuring him, because her lack of pressure leaves him alone with what pressure was once covering. His own passivity, his own fear, his own delay, his own inner unrest. This can lead to a strange emotional response. He may become more thoughtful, more restless, more inward, more aware that something has shifted, even if he cannot fully name it. He may miss the emotional noise without realizing that what he actually misses is the familiar structure her tension created. He may begin to understand that her old energy was not only painful for her, it was also functioning as an unconscious support for the bond. Now that support is gone, and he feels the difference. This does not always make him instantly rise, but it often begins destabilizing the old comfort of stagnation. Because stagnation is easier to tolerate when someone else is still supplying the emotional charge. When that charge fades, stagnation feels heavier, colder, more obvious, less spiritually disguised. That is one of the most sacred effects of relaxation. It takes what was hidden in the atmosphere and makes it visible through contrast. Her old tension versus her new calm. The old field versus the new one. The old emotional pressure versus the new quiet. And in that contrast, he begins to see what the tension had been doing. Holding, pressing, covering, sustaining, buffering. Once he feels its absence, he may also begin realizing how much of the connection's emotional life had depended on her strain. That is a hard truth. But it is also liberating. Because once the tension is gone, the bond can no longer rely on her unrest to feel alive. Now it must stand on a different kind of truth. And if he is going to rise, he must begin doing so from within himself. Not in response to the old emotional pressure she once carried. That is why the absence of her tension matters so much. It changes the rules of the field. It removes one of the main supports of the old pattern. And once that support is gone, the masculine can no longer remain as comfortably entangled in the same way. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 4. When the divine feminine relaxes, he feels the absence of her tension. He feels the disappearance of the invisible pressure, urgency, and emotional gripping that had long been shaping the bond's atmosphere. Her tension had become part of the field, part of the continuity, part of what kept the connection emotionally loud even while it remained unresolved. When that tension is gone, the field becomes quieter, cleaner, and more revealing. He may not know how to name it, but he feels the difference. And in that difference, his own stillness, fear, passivity, and truth become harder to avoid. That is why her relaxation changes so much. Because sometimes what awakens him is not what she starts doing. It is what she finally stops carrying. And once that tension leaves the field, something deeper begins asking him to rise on his own. Chapter 5. Her relaxation stops carrying him unconsciously. One of the deepest things that happens when the divine feminine relaxes is this. She stops carrying him unconsciously. And that changes everything. Because before she relaxes, she may be doing much more than loving him. She may be carrying the emotional weight of the bond, the spiritual tension of the silence, the energetic pressure of what is unresolved. the constant inner effort to hold open a connection that has not yet become mutual in embodied truth. She may not call it that. She may call it love, patience, faith, holding space, staying connected, trusting the journey. But often, underneath those spiritual names, there is still a very real energetic reality. She is compensating for his slowness, for his silence, for his uncertainty, for his emotional underfunctioning, for the lack of movement by carrying more movement inside herself. And as long as she is doing that, she is unconsciously carrying him. Not his soul, not his destiny, not his full awakening, but his side of the field. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. Her overfunctioning may have been compensating for his underfunctioning. That is why the old pattern stayed alive. When one person is always generating the emotional movement, the other does not have to generate as much. When one person is constantly carrying the tension, the hope, the spiritual focus, the invisible labor, the other can remain partly buffered from the full weight of their own stillness. It may not be deliberate. It may not even be conscious, but it is real. This is what many divine feminines do not fully realize until much later. They think they are simply staying loving. But in many cases, they are also keeping the connection emotionally afloat. They are maintaining the current, maintaining the sense of continuity, maintaining the warmth of possibility, maintaining the internal movement that prevents the bond from falling fully into stillness. That stillness matters, because stillness reveals. But as long as she is unconsciously carrying him, stillness does not fully arrive. There is always motion, always pressure, always her energy bridging the gap. That bridge becomes part of the structure. He may not consciously know how much he has come to rely on it. He may not wake up thinking, she is carrying this for me. But unconsciously, emotionally, spiritually, some part of him may be adapted to the fact that she is still doing so much. Still emotionally turning toward him. Still holding the space. Still keeping the bond alive through her own nervous system. This makes his passivity easier to live inside. That is the painful paradox. Because when someone else is unconsciously carrying part of your movement, you can remain unrisen without fully feeling the urgency to rise. This does not mean he feels nothing. It means he does not have to fully generate his own energetic honesty, while she is still doing so much for both of them. That is why her relaxation matters so much. Because when she relaxes, she stops compensating, stops overholding, stops overgenerating, stops oversustaining, stops doing the invisible spiritual labor of keeping the entire field alive through her tension. And once she stops, responsibility returns. That is the sacred shift. Responsibility returns to him. Not as punishment, as truth. Now he can no longer rely on her constant inner movement to create momentum. Now he can no longer unconsciously feed off her vigilance, her hope, her emotional labor, her tension-filled devotion. Now he has to begin generating his own movement from within. That is why her relaxation can become the first real moment of spiritual pressure for him. Not pressure from her. Pressure from the fact that she is no longer carrying what belongs to him to carry. This is where the field changes in a very precise way. Before, the bond may have had movement because she was generating it. She was thinking, feeling, monitoring, hoping, trying, straining. He may have remained partly asleep inside the emotional current she created. Now she relaxes. Now the current slows. Now the field is quieter. And what happens then? He feels the lack. Not just the lack of her energy in the old way. The lack of his own movement. That can be deeply unsettling. Because when someone stops compensating for you, your stillness becomes more visible to yourself. Your delay becomes heavier. Your passivity becomes more uncomfortable. the old arrangement loses its emotional support system. And without that support system, what once felt tolerable begins feeling exposing. This is often the first stage of his rising. Not action. Discomfort. A subtle but unmistakable discomfort with staying where he is. He may begin to feel the awkwardness of his non-movement, the emotional weight of his passivity, the emptiness where her tension used to create a sense of continuity, the pressure of having to meet the field more honestly from within himself. That is what her relaxation does. It stops doing the work for him. This is not the same as abandoning him. It is refusing to unconsciously enable his stagnation. That is a very important distinction. Because love is not meant to become a hidden infrastructure for someone else's avoidance. Love is not meant to become the place where one person silently carries all the emotional and spiritual labor while the other remains protected from the full consequence of underparticipating. When the divine feminine is still tightly holding the field, she may not realize that her devotion has also become a kind of unconscious support beam for his delay. Relaxation removes that beam. And once the beam is gone, the old structure cannot stand in the same way. This is why the masculine may begin feeling more pressure after she relaxes. Not because she is pressuring him, because the field now asks more of him. Before, her tension kept supplying movement. Now, if movement is going to happen, it must come more honestly from him. That is where responsibility enters. And responsibility is spiritual. Because rising is never only about missing someone, or feeling emotionally stirred, or noticing the shift in the bond. Rising is about becoming responsible for what you feel. Becoming responsible for the parts of the connection that you once allowed someone else to energetically carry. Becoming responsible for the truth that has been there all along, but buffered by someone else's overfunctioning. That is why her relaxation can be so transformative. Because it does not only create peace for her, it creates accountability for him. Again, not forced accountability. Energetic accountability. A cleaner field where he can no longer stay as comfortably dependent on her inner labor. That is often the moment he begins to realize. No one is pushing this forward for me now. No one is carrying the emotional current in the old way. No one is making my stillness feel spiritually meaningful through their suffering. Now what I do not generate, I feel. That realization can shake him deeply. Because before, he may have mistaken her effort for the natural state of the bond. He may have assumed the connection would simply remain emotionally active in that way. But when her tension and overfunctioning stop, he begins to see that much of what felt alive was being actively maintained by her. Now that maintenance is over. And maintenance matters. Without it, the field reveals what is actually mutual, what is actually stagnant, what has been spiritually delayed, what now belongs to him to move. That is why her relaxation becomes a turning point. Because she is no longer carrying him unconsciously. No longer carrying his side of the emotional labor. No longer carrying the tension that kept him buffered. No longer carrying the movement that let him remain still without fully feeling it. Now he must feel his own stillness. And once a man fully feels the cost of his own stillness, something in him often begins to rise. Not because she pushed him, because she stopped holding him down with her compensation. That is a profound spiritual truth. Sometimes what keeps a man from rising is not only his fear. Sometimes it is also the fact that someone else is still carrying enough of the field that he does not yet feel the necessity of rising from within himself. When that carrying stops, necessity enters. And necessity is often the beginning of masculine movement. This may not look dramatic at first. It may look like inner conflict, restlessness, memory, subtle emotional pressure, the quiet discomfort of knowing he can no longer remain in the same passive position without feeling it more deeply. But that discomfort matters. because discomfort is often the soul's first protest against staying down. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 5. When the divine feminine relaxes, she stops carrying him unconsciously. She stops compensating for his lack of movement with her own overfunctioning, her own tension, and her own invisible spiritual labor. As long as she was doing that, the old pattern had support. He could remain partly buffered, partly still, partly protected from the full truth of his own passivity. But once she relaxes, that support disappears. Now the field returns responsibility to him. He must begin generating his own movement, his own honesty, his own rising from within. And that is why her relaxation can change everything, because sometimes the most loving thing she can do is stop carrying what was quietly keeping him from having to rise on his own. And once she stops carrying him, the field finally becomes honest enough for his soul to feel the invitation and the pressure to stand up. Chapter 6. Her calmness becomes a mirror. One of the deepest reasons he begins to rise when the divine feminine relaxes is this. Her calmness becomes a mirror. Not a lecture. Not a punishment. Not an emotional demand. A mirror. And that mirror can confront him more deeply than all the tension that came before it. Because tension often keeps both people busy. Busy reacting. Busy interpreting. Busy surviving. Busy staying connected through anxiety, pain, longing, and subtle emotional pressure. But calmness changes the whole experience of the field. Calmness does not chase him. It does not pull on him. It does not beg for movement. It does not try to force awareness. It simply stands there, clear and regulated, and by standing there it reveals what is not yet clear and regulated in him. That is why her calmness can be so spiritually powerful. It creates contrast. And contrast is one of the most revealing forces in any soul connection. Before she relaxes, the field may still be saturated with her tension. Her fear, her hyper-awareness, her internal gripping, her emotional overfunctioning all create a kind of atmosphere he can live inside. That atmosphere may be painful, but it is familiar. It gives shape to the dynamic. It gives him something to orient around, even if he remains passive, delayed, or inwardly conflicted. The field still has motion because she is carrying so much of it. Then she relaxes. Now the motion changes. Now the atmosphere is different. She is calmer, more rooted, less reactive, less energetically entangled in his pace, less available to the old loop. And suddenly, what once blended into the field begins standing out inside him. His restlessness, his avoidance, his emotional delay, his dependence on external pressure to feel the connection, his discomfort with stillness, his lack of inner peace. That is what the mirror shows. Her calmness does not accuse him of these things. It reveals them by contrast. Imagine standing in a dim room for years. Over time, your eyes adapt to the darkness. You begin to think this is normal. This is just how the room is. Then one day, the curtains open. The light does not attack the darkness. It simply makes the darkness visible. That is what her calmness does. It opens the curtains. And once the light enters, he may begin to notice parts of himself that had remained hidden inside the old emotional atmosphere. He may notice how unsettled he really is. How much his silence is not peace, but protection. How much his delay is not groundedness, but hesitation. How much of his inner life is still organized around fear instead of truth. This is why her calmness can disturb him more than her pain. Pain kept the old pattern active. Calmness exposes it. Pain still gave him an emotional structure to lean against. Calmness removes that structure and leaves him face to face with what is actually happening inside him. That can be deeply uncomfortable, because many men can handle emotional chaos better than emotional clarity. Chaos gives them something to manage, something to resist. something to blame, fix, or escape. But clarity leaves them with themselves. And when the divine feminine becomes calm, she is no longer feeding the chaos. She is no longer making the field emotionally noisy enough for him to avoid hearing his own inner state. Now he has to hear it. This is where the mirror becomes spiritual, because what she reflects back to him is not only his current behavior. She reflects his level of embodiment. Her peace reveals his unrest. Her self-possession reveals his fragmentation. Her relaxed nervous system reveals how much of his life may still be organized around subtle defense. This is not because she is better than him. It is because she changed. And when one person truly changes, the field begins telling the truth about what remains unchanged in the other. That truth can be hard to face. He may not immediately think, her calmness is showing me my own lack of peace. Instead, he may simply feel uneasy. He may think about her more, feel more emotional pressure, experience memory more vividly, feel the connection becoming strangely louder in silence. Why? Because now he is no longer reacting to her tension. He is reacting to what her tension used to hide. That is a crucial distinction. Before, her anxious energy may have made everything feel active enough that his own inner state stayed partly concealed. Now her calmness clears the field. And in a clear field, what is unresolved in him becomes easier to feel. This is why her nervous system regulation can disturb the part of him still organized around avoidance. Avoidance needs fog. It needs noise. It needs delay. It needs ambiguity. It needs enough emotional movement around it that truth never fully lands. Calmness removes fog. Now truth lands. Now he may begin to feel the cost of still being emotionally passive. The discomfort of remaining unrisen while she is no longer holding the field in the same way. The strange exposure of realizing that her peace is not rejecting him, but revealing him, that can create deep inner conflict. Because one part of him may be drawn to her calmness, drawn to the safety, the steadiness, the truth, the quiet power of someone no longer trying to control the bond through tension. But another part of him may feel deeply threatened by it. Threatened not because calmness is hostile, but because it leaves him with fewer illusions. He can no longer hide inside the old emotional contract. He can no longer assume her tension will keep the field active for both of them. He can no longer depend on her nervous system to hold the urgency while he remains delayed. Now he must meet a calmer field. And a calmer field asks harder things. It asks, what are you actually bringing here? What remains when she is no longer overcarrying? Who are you in the presence of truth without drama? Those are not easy questions. They are mirror questions. And mirror questions can become the beginning of masculine rising. Because once a man sees himself more clearly, he cannot fully go back to not seeing. He may still resist, still delay, still move slowly. But the old unconscious comfort begins breaking down. He starts noticing that staying down feels heavier now, that passivity feels more exposed, that his own lack of movement no longer hides as easily inside the field. This is why her calmness is not passive. It has spiritual pressure, not the pressure of pursuit, the pressure of contrast. Her groundedness makes the old pattern look less natural. Her peace makes his unrest easier to feel. Her relaxed presence makes his own disconnection from self harder to romanticize. And that is exactly why he may begin rising after she relaxes. Not because she made him rise. Because her calmness stopped supporting the version of him that could remain comfortably unrisen. That is the deeper truth of chapter 6. Her calmness becomes a mirror by revealing, through contrast, what is still unresolved in him. It shows his restlessness, delay, fear, avoidance, or emotional immaturity not by attacking him, but by standing in a different state of being. Her peace makes the old pattern more visible. Her groundedness makes his fragmentation harder to ignore. And her nervous system regulation can deeply disturb the part of him still organized around avoidance. Because calmness clears the field enough for truth to land. That is why her relaxation can become such a turning point. It is not only that she changes. It is that her change reflects him back to himself more honestly than before. Because sometimes a man does not rise because someone pushes him. Sometimes he rises because someone becomes so calm, clear, and rooted that he can no longer avoid seeing where he still is not. Chapter 7. He begins to feel the cost of staying down. One of the deepest things that happens when the divine feminine relaxes is this. He begins to feel the cost of staying down. Not just the cost of losing access to her old energy. Not just the discomfort of silence. Not just the absence of her tension, her overfunctioning, or the familiar emotional atmosphere she used to maintain. He begins to feel the cost of his own non-movement. And that is where something sacred begins shifting inside him. Because before she relaxed, staying down may not have felt that costly. It may have felt manageable, reasonable, even safe. He could stay delayed, half open, half closed, uncertain, internally conflicted, emotionally passive, and the field would still remain active because she was carrying so much. Her tension, her hope, her inner labor, her subtle emotional gripping kept the bond moving. It may not have moved cleanly, but it moved. There was pressure, momentum, emotional continuity. Something in the atmosphere that made his stillness easier to inhabit. That matters. Because as long as someone else is carrying enough energy in the field, your own lack of movement can remain partially hidden. Not gone. Hidden. Softened. Buffered. Made less confronting than it truly is. But when she relaxes, that buffering begins to disappear. Now there is less tension holding the bond together. Less emotional noise. Less unconscious support for his stagnation. And suddenly, staying down feels different. Heavier. That is the truth of this chapter. Her relaxation does not automatically make him rise in some dramatic, outward, instant way. What it often does first is make staying where he is feel more costly. And cost is one of the great awakeners. Because people can remain inside unhealthy patterns for a long time if those patterns still feel easier than change. A man can stay in delay if delay still feels safe enough. He can stay emotionally passive if passivity is still being padded by someone else's overgiving. He can remain divided if the field still allows him to feel connected without fully showing up. But once the divine feminine relaxes, the equation changes. Now his passivity is no longer being cushioned the same way. Now his stillness is no longer hidden inside her movement. Now his delay is no longer surrounded by her anxious devotion. So what happens? He starts feeling it. The weight of it. The awkwardness of it. The deadness of it. The spiritual exhaustion of remaining in the same position when the field is no longer making that position feel emotionally sustainable. This is why her relaxation can create such strong inner pressure in him. Not because she is pressuring him. Because her lack of tension exposes the cost of his own. Before, her nervous system may have been carrying urgency for both of them. Her emotional labor may have supplied enough motion that he did not have to fully feel the stagnation of staying down. But now the atmosphere is different. Her calmness is no longer making room for the old pattern in the same way. She is not gripping the connection. She is not holding it in strain. She is not pouring life force into the unresolved. And because she is not doing that, the unresolved starts feeling more unresolved. This is what many people misunderstand. They think the masculine rises because the feminine withdrew, and now he is afraid of losing her. Sometimes fear is part of it. But more deeply, he rises because the old comfort of staying unrisen begins collapsing. He can no longer remain in the same degree of delay without feeling the cost more directly. That cost may show up quietly at first. A heaviness in the silence. A strange dissatisfaction with his own passivity. A growing inability to romanticize delay as timing. An awareness that his non-movement is no longer neutral. A restlessness that does not go away because the field no longer supports the old unconscious arrangement. This is where the real shift begins. He starts feeling that staying down is not peace. It is weight. That is a profound realization for the masculine. Because many men confuse stillness with passivity, and passivity with safety. They think that by not moving, not choosing, not speaking, not fully entering, they are protecting themselves. And maybe for a season they are. But her relaxation changes the field enough that non-movement starts losing its illusion of safety. Now non-movement begins feeling like self-betrayal. Or at least like self-abandonment of another kind. Because once he has been shown a cleaner field, a calmer truth, a more regulated feminine presence, staying in the old pattern begins to feel smaller. Less alive, less justified, less spiritually tolerable. He may begin to feel this as discomfort before he names it as cost. He may become more inward, more emotionally pressured, more aware of time, more aware of what he has not done, more aware that something in him is being asked to respond, not just observe. This is what it means to feel the cost of staying down. It is the moment when remaining passive starts hurting more than it used to. And that matters. Because spiritual rising often begins not when a man becomes perfectly ready, but when staying where he is becomes too heavy for the soul to keep calling fine. Her relaxation often creates exactly that condition. Not by demanding more, by doing less, by no longer carrying the urgency, by no longer over-signaling, by no longer holding his side of the field unconsciously. This forces a new kind of confrontation. Now the field says, if movement is going to happen, it must come more honestly from you. If truth is going to rise, you must participate in it. If the bond matters, you can no longer lean on her tension to make it feel alive. That can be sobering, because it reveals how much of his old comfort depended on her imbalance. Not because he wanted her imbalance, but because he had adapted to it. Now he feels what it is like when that support is gone. And without that support, staying down can start feeling like a spiritual dead zone. This is why he may begin to notice the weight of delay. Not just, I haven't moved yet, but what delay has become. A habit, a shield, a place to hide, a way of postponing not only the relationship, but his own becoming. That is where the chapter becomes spiritual. Because the deeper cost of staying down is not only that the connection remains unresolved. It is that he remains unresolved. He remains beneath his own potential, beneath his own truth, beneath the man he could become if he stopped organizing himself around caution, passivity, and emotional half-life. This is why her relaxation can activate him so deeply. It is not only about her becoming more peaceful. It is about her no longer supporting the version of him that stays down. The old field may have allowed him to remain in delay without fully feeling the deadness of it. The new field does not. The new field is quieter, cleaner, more truthful. And in that field, delay has less romance. Passivity has less camouflage. The old story of later begins losing its emotional shelter. Now he may feel the drag of his own inertia, the shame of his own hesitation, the inner pressure of knowing more than he is embodying, the ache of seeing what she has stopped carrying and what now belongs to him. This is often where rising begins in seed form. Not yet action, but refusal. A soul-level refusal to remain as comfortably asleep as before. He may not know what to do yet. He may still move through confusion, silence, conflict, memory, or resistance. But something in him starts understanding. I cannot keep living in the same degree of non-movement, without paying for it internally. That is a turning point. Because once a man feels the internal price of staying down, rising becomes more possible. Not because rising suddenly becomes easy. Because staying down becomes unbearable in a new way. That is often the first real spiritual pressure toward masculine movement. Not outside pressure. Inner consequence. This is also why the divine feminine must understand the sacredness of her relaxation. She is not only choosing peace for herself, though that alone is holy. She is also no longer colluding with stagnation by carrying the field in overdrive. She is letting the bond reveal what happens when no one else is unconsciously compensating for his lack of rise. That revelation may be exactly what his soul needs. Because some men do not rise when someone pleads. They rise when the old way of staying down no longer feels livable. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 7. When the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to feel the cost of staying down. Without her tension, overfunctioning, and invisible support, his passivity becomes heavier. His delay becomes more revealing, and his non-movement becomes harder to live inside comfortably. The field no longer cushions his stagnation in the same way. Her calmness makes the old pattern more visible, and that visibility creates inner pressure. He may begin to feel the discomfort of emotional inertia, the weight of hesitation, and the quiet shame of knowing he is no longer meeting the truth of the bond honestly. This does not always create immediate outer action, but it often creates the first sacred dissatisfaction with remaining where he is. And that dissatisfaction is where his rise begins. Because sometimes a man does not begin to rise when he is pushed upward. Sometimes he begins to rise when staying low finally costs too much. Chapter 8. Rising may begin quietly, not dramatically. One of the most important truths in this journey is this. When he begins to rise, it may not look dramatic at first. Not like a grand confession. Not like immediate clarity. Not like instant communication, instant union, or some sudden outward transformation that makes everything obvious and easy to understand. Very often, rising begins quietly. And that quietness is where many people misread the process. Because they expect visible movement. They expect the masculine to suddenly know exactly what he feels, exactly what he wants, exactly how to fix what was broken, and exactly how to step into the bond in a mature and embodied way. But inner rising rarely begins that cleanly. Why? Because the soul often rises before the outer man knows how to move. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. The soul can awaken to truth long before the nervous system knows how to hold it. The heart can soften long before the ego knows how to surrender. The inner world can begin shifting long before behavior catches up. That gap is where the quiet beginning lives. When the divine feminine relaxes, the field becomes cleaner, less padded by her tension, less organized around her nervous system gripping, less protected by the old emotional structure that once made his stagnation feel more tolerable. In that clearer field, something starts happening inside him. But what begins inside him is not always immediately usable. It may first show up as memory, inner conflict, emotional restlessness, unexpected tenderness, a strange heaviness in silence, a delayed realization that her calmness changed more than all her previous effort ever did. This is often how he begins to rise. Quietly, underneath the surface. And because it happens this way, it can be easy to mistake the early stages of rising for nothing. But sometimes what looks like nothing is actually everything rearranging underneath. Imagine a seed underground. From the surface, nothing seems different. The soil looks the same. The field looks still. No visible breakthrough has happened. But beneath the surface, the shell is breaking. The roots are forming. Life is gathering itself in the dark before it knows how to rise into the light. That is often what masculine rising looks like in the beginning. Notre spectacle. Reorganization. A man may begin thinking about her more, but not yet know how to reach out. He may begin feeling the weight of his own passivity, but not yet know how to turn that awareness into embodied movement. He may begin seeing the truth of the bond more clearly, but still feel ashamed, afraid, unprepared, or emotionally underdeveloped in the face of what that truth asks of him. That does not mean the rising is false. It often means the rising is real enough to destabilize him. This is why Chapter 8 matters so much. Because many people think movement is only real once it becomes visible. But some of the deepest movement happens in silence first. A man becomes quieter because something in him is no longer comfortable. He becomes restless because the old self no longer fits as easily. He becomes nostalgic because memory is now carrying more truth than before. He becomes inward because a cleaner field is making his own soul louder. Those are not always signs of avoidance alone. Sometimes they are signs of inner rising. Not complete rising. Not embodied rising. But the beginning. This is where the divine feminine must be careful not to romanticize his silence, but also not to misunderstand what silence can mean. Silence does not always equal awakening. Some people remain silent because they are choosing avoidance. That is true, but in genuine spiritual transformation, there is often a stage where the old identity starts cracking before the new self can speak with confidence. The inner man is moving, but the outer man is still learning how to stand under the weight of that movement. That can look messy. It can look like distance mixed with tenderness, stillness mixed with longing, awareness mixed with fear, softening mixed with confusion. This is the paradox of rising. He may feel more before he acts more. Why? Because feeling is often the first stage of spiritual responsibility. Before a man can move differently, he often has to feel differently. Not just feel her. Feel himself. Feel the cost of staying down. Feel the deadness of old passivity. Feel the ache of the life he has been postponing inside himself. Feel the truth of what her relaxation revealed. That is a lot. And if he has spent years organized around control, delay, or emotional self-protection, then this new level of feeling can be overwhelming at first. He may not have emotional language for it yet. He may not know how to trust it. He may try to return to distraction, logic, or old routines. But if the rising is real, something in him will keep feeling the friction. That friction matters. Because friction is often the sign that the soul is no longer fully aligned with the old life. The old life says, stay still, stay safe, stay hidden. Do not move until you can guarantee control. But the rising soul says, this is not enough anymore. You are more than this passivity. The field has changed. The old delay no longer feels peaceful. Something in you wants to stand up. That voice may be quiet, but quiet does not mean weak. Quiet things can have enormous power. A small memory returning at the wrong time. A sudden heaviness when he thinks of her peace. A sense that the old pattern has lost its emotional shelter. A strange inability to enjoy what once distracted him. A subtle but growing discomfort with staying exactly as he has been. These are often signs that the rising has already begun. Again, not in finished form. In seed form. And seed form matters, because no tree begins as a tree. It begins hidden. The same is true spiritually. He may rise first as memory, as longing, as conscience, as discomfort, as the haunting realization that her relaxation revealed more about him than he wanted to admit. All of these things are quiet forms of movement. The soul begins rising before the outer man becomes skillful enough to express that rise cleanly. This is also why delayed realization is so common. The divine feminine may have relaxed weeks or months ago. The field changed. The tension left. Her peace became the new atmosphere. But his conscious mind may only now be starting to understand what that shift meant. What once felt like less now feels like truth. What once looked like distance now feels like consequence. What once seemed manageable now feels spiritually expensive. That is rising. Not because he has solved everything. Because he can no longer live as easily inside the old unconsciousness. This is why even subtle movement matters. A man remembering differently matters. A man feeling more discomfort with passivity matters. A man being touched by her calmness more than her old tension mattered. A man becoming inwardly more honest, even before he becomes outwardly more embodied. All of that matters. Because rising is not always a leap. Sometimes it is a slow departure from stagnation. A slow refusal to keep calling non-movement peace. A slow awakening to the fact that the soul wants more than the old life can give. A slow gathering of strength to meet what truth is now requiring. This is where patience becomes sacred. Not patience that waits in fantasy. Patience that understands process without lying about it. Because the outer man may lag behind the inner shift. He may still wobble, still resist, still be in conflict, still not know how to act from the place his soul is beginning to reach toward. But once the soul rises, even quietly, the journey is different. He can no longer fully belong to the old stillness. That is the key. The old stillness may remain outwardly for a time, but inwardly it is no longer the same. Now it contains friction, pressure, awareness, longing, the beginning of spiritual discomfort with who he has been. That is a real kind of rise. And often, it is the only rise possible at first. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 8. Rising may begin quietly, not dramatically. When the divine feminine relaxes, the masculine soul may begin moving long before his outer behavior clearly reflects it. His rising may first appear as memory, emotional restlessness, nostalgia, inner conflict, tenderness, delayed realization, or subtle dissatisfaction with staying where he has been. This does not always mean instant clarity or immediate action. It often means the inner structure is changing. The soul has begun standing up before the outer man fully knows how to embody what is rising. And that quiet beginning matters. Because real transformation rarely starts with a perfect performance. It starts with the moment the old way of staying still no longer feels spiritually livable. Because sometimes the first sign that he is rising is not that he reaches out. It is that he can no longer remain at peace with staying down. Chapter 9. What he is really rising toward. When the divine feminine relaxes and the masculine begins to rise, he is not only rising toward her. He is rising toward himself. That is the deeper truth. And until that is understood, the whole process can be reduced to something much smaller than it really is. People may look at these dynamics and think the masculine only begins moving because he feels her pulling away, because he misses her energy, because he senses the shift and wants access again. Sometimes those surface reactions are there. But beneath them, something much more sacred is happening. He is being called upward, not only relationally, spiritually. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because if we only frame his rise as a reaction to her, we miss the deepest transformation. The real rise is not only toward union, communication, closeness, or movement in the bond. The real rise is toward truth, toward responsibility, toward embodiment, toward the man he is being asked to become now that the old field can no longer support the version of him that stayed small, delayed, passive, divided, or hidden. That is what he is really rising toward. Before the divine feminine relaxed, he may still have been able to live inside a half state. Half open, half awake, half responsive, half accountable. Her tension, her overcarrying, her nervous system vigilance, and her emotional labor kept enough energy in the field that he did not have to fully generate his own rise. He could remain partly buffered, partly hidden from the full cost of remaining where he was. Then she relaxed. Now the old emotional scaffolding begins collapsing. Now he can no longer rely on her overfunctioning to create movement. Now the field is asking him something much more direct. Who are you when no one is carrying this for you anymore? That is not a small question. That is a spiritual threshold. Because the answer is no longer about her alone. It is about who he is becoming in response to truth. He may begin to realize that what is rising in him is not just the wish to reconnect, but the pressure to become more honest, more emotionally embodied, more conscious of the gap between what he feels and how he has been living. This is the deeper nature of masculine rising. It is not just movement toward the feminine. It is movement out of stagnation, out of emotional passivity, out of unconscious avoidance, out of the old identity that could stay in delay without fully feeling the consequence of it. That is why her relaxation can be so spiritually catalytic. It does not only reveal what he feels for her. It reveals what his current way of being can no longer sustain inside himself. This is often where he begins rising toward responsibility. Responsibility not in the shallow sense of doing the right thing to keep a connection, but responsibility in the soul sense. Responsibility for his own truth. Responsibility for his own fear. Responsibility for the places where he has remained half asleep while something sacred was asking him to wake up. Responsibility for the emotional labor he allowed another person to carry while he remained in internal suspension. This kind of responsibility can feel heavy, because once a man begins sensing it, he may also begin sensing all the places he has not yet lived from it. He may see how often he stayed in observation instead of participation, how often he let uncertainty become a hiding place, how often he depended on her energy to keep the bond emotionally active, how often he called passivity time or space or not being ready. These realizations are not only relational, they are moral and spiritual. They touch the deeper question. What kind of man am I when love becomes real enough to require something from me? That is what he is really rising toward. Not merely her. His own answer to that question. This is why rising often comes with discomfort. Because becoming more responsible is not always immediately flattering to the ego. The ego prefers comfort, delay, and stories that preserve innocence. The soul asks for embodiment. The soul asks him to become congruent, to live closer to what he actually knows, to stop outsourcing movement to the field she once maintained and begin generating movement from within himself. That can be frightening, because if a man has built much of his inner life around emotional caution, rising toward responsibility can feel like the death of an old self. He may sense that if he truly rises, he cannot remain the same man. He cannot stay half-hidden and still call it peace. He cannot stay emotionally delayed and still feel clean inside it. He cannot stay defined by fear and still ignore what the soul now knows. This is why rising is also toward embodiment. Embodiment means becoming a man whose outer life can carry his inner truth. A man who no longer feels deeply while living shallowly. A man who no longer hides behind emotional passivity while secretly longing for something more. A man whose choices begin matching what his soul has recognized. That is a huge shift, and it does not happen all at once. It may begin very subtly. A discomfort with old patterns, a deepening awareness of his own delay, a stronger response to truth, a growing inability to tolerate the old half-state, a sense that something in him must now become more real. That is rising. Even if the outer world still looks quiet, he is also rising toward emotional truth. This is one of the biggest transformations of all. Because many men know how to feel without admitting, know how to care without naming, know how to long without embodying. Emotional truth asks for more. It asks him not only to sense what is real, but to stop hiding from the fact that it is real. to stop reducing sacred contact into manageable concepts, to stop pretending that what touches him deeply can remain forever unspoken without cost. That is where the soul begins applying pressure. Not the pressure of panic, the pressure of inner congruence, the pressure that says, what you know and how you live can no longer remain this far apart. That pressure can eventually become the foundation of real rising. Because a man does not become spiritually awake only by feeling something powerful. He becomes spiritually awake when what he feels begins challenging the life he has been living. That is exactly what happens here. Her relaxation creates the field where he can no longer remain as comfortable in the old version of himself. And once that discomfort becomes deep enough, he begins rising not only toward connection, but toward the deeper manhood that connection requires. This is why the question matters. Is her relaxation making space not just for reunion, but for his transformation? Yes. At the deepest level, that is exactly what is happening. If the bond is real, then the feminine's relaxation does not merely make him notice her more. It makes him notice the man he has been versus the man he could become. It reveals the gap between emotional dependence and emotional maturity, between passive longing and active embodiment, between being spiritually stirred and being spiritually responsible. That gap is what rising moves through. Not always elegantly, not always quickly, but truly. This is why the divine masculine's rise is ultimately not just toward her energy, her love, or her return. It is toward integration, toward a masculinity that can hold truth without retreating, toward a masculinity that can feel without collapsing into fear, toward a masculinity that can participate in love instead of remaining spiritually adjacent to it, toward a masculinity that does not need the feminine's tension to know that movement is required. That is what her relaxation makes possible. Because when she stops feeding distortion, the field begins calling him into coherence. And coherence is where rising becomes real. He may resist it, delay it, struggle with it. But once the soul has heard the call, it cannot fully return to the old unconscious comfort. He now knows too much. He knows what her peace feels like. He knows what the old pattern cost. He knows that staying down feels different now. He knows that something in him is being asked to stand up. That standing up may begin quietly, as discomfort, as self-recognition, as the painful awareness that his current self is too small for what the soul now knows. But even that is a rise. Because once a man begins wanting to become more true than he has been, the rise has already started. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 9. What he is really rising toward is not only the divine feminine. He is rising toward truth, responsibility, embodiment, and the man he is being called to become. Her relaxation does not merely make him miss her. It removes the old support for stagnation and reveals the gap between what he feels and how he has been living. That gap creates spiritual pressure. It invites him toward deeper emotional honesty, greater inner congruence, and a masculinity no longer built around passivity, fear, and half-presence. And once he begins rising toward that deeper self, the connection becomes more than a relationship dynamic. It becomes a path of transformation. Because in the end, the masculine does not truly rise when he only wants her back. He truly rises when he begins wanting to become the man who can finally meet what love has been asking of him all along. Chapter 10. The deeper meaning of why he rises. In the end, when the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to rise not because she finally found the perfect strategy. He begins to rise because she stops feeding what kept him comfortably unrisen. That is the deepest truth of this entire journey. Before she relaxed, the connection may still have been held together by tension. Her nervous system was carrying urgency. Her heart was carrying the hope, the pain, the overfunctioning, the invisible labor of trying to keep the bond warm, meaningful, spiritually alive. Even if she called it patience, devotion, or holding space, much of it was still strain. And strain has consequences. It keeps the old pattern active. It keeps the field emotionally crowded. It keeps him buffered from the full weight of his own passivity. It allows him to remain partly asleep because some part of her is still carrying the movement for both of them. But when she truly relaxes, something sacred happens. She stops. She stops gripping, stops managing, stops spiritually overextending, stops making his pace the center of her body, her thoughts, and her emotional reality. And once she stops, the old pattern begins losing its support. That is why he begins to rise. Not because she pushed harder, because she finally stopped holding him down with unconscious compensation. That is the real meaning of the shift. Her relaxation is not passivity. It is purification. It removes the tension that had been distorting the field. It removes the emotional scaffolding that kept stagnation emotionally livable. It removes the subtle ways she was carrying what only he could ultimately choose to carry. And when those things fall away, truth becomes louder. Truth about him. Truth about the bond. Truth about what has been delayed. Truth about what can no longer stay hidden behind silence, distance, or emotional half-presence. This is what rising really is. It is not always dramatic movement at first. Not always immediate reunion. Not always clear words or visible action. Sometimes rising begins as discomfort, as inner conflict, as memory returning, as the growing inability to remain at peace with staying where he has been. And that matters, because spiritual rising does not always begin when a man feels strong. Sometimes it begins when the old way of staying down no longer feels spiritually livable. That is what her relaxation creates. A cleaner field, a quieter field, a more honest field. And in that field, he can no longer lean on her tension to generate movement. No longer rely on her emotional labor to keep the atmosphere warm. No longer remain as comfortable in passivity while someone else silently carries the cost. Now he must face his stillness, his delay, his fear, his true feelings, and the man he is being asked to become. That is why her peace can become the very ground of his rising. Because peace is not empty. Peace reveals. It shows him what she is no longer doing. It shows him what he has not yet done. It shows him the difference between a bond carried through tension and a bond left standing in truth. And truth has gravity. It draws things upward. It makes the soul restless with staying below what it knows. This is why the divine feminine relaxing can become one of the holiest moments in the whole connection. Not because she manipulates him into growth, because she stops interrupting the truth that growth requires. She comes back to herself, back to her body, back to her life, back to her joy, back to her trust, back to her dignity. And from that place, she no longer feeds the old distortion. That absence of distortion becomes spiritual pressure for him. Not pressure from her. Pressure from the fact that stagnation is no longer being emotionally supported in the same way. That can become the beginning of his rise toward responsibility, embodiment, emotional truth, self-recognition, and a masculinity no longer built around delay. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 10. When the divine feminine relaxes, he begins to rise because her relaxation ends the old tension that was helping hold the pattern together. She stops unconsciously carrying his side of the field, and in doing so she returns responsibility, truth, and spiritual pressure to where they belong. He is no longer reacting mainly to her strain. He is being asked to meet himself in a cleaner, quieter, more honest field. And once that happens, the old version of staying down becomes harder to sustain. That is why her relaxation is so powerful. It does not force his rising. It makes room for it. So if you are the divine feminine in a season of relaxation, remember this. You are not losing the connection by returning to peace. You are restoring truth. You are not becoming passive. You are becoming aligned. You are not loving less. You are loving without strain now. And that is sacred. If the bond is real, your peace will not destroy what is meant. It will reveal it, purify it, test it, and return each soul to the place where real transformation can begin. Sometimes the holiest thing a woman can do is stop gripping what love was never asking her to hold alone. And sometimes when she finally exhales, the soul on the other side finally begins to stand. If this message resonated with you, share in the comments. Have you ever noticed more movement in the connection after you stopped forcing it? And if you want more deep videos on divine feminine energy, divine masculine awakening, surrender, healing, and soul connection, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.